So, would like to talk a little bit about the Vietnam War to kind of set a perspective for the movie that is the centerpiece of your assignment on Vietnam. And as you can see, it says it's a 30-year commitment that the United States made in Vietnam from the end of World War II in 1945 to the mid-1970s. And there were several phases and stages of that. And we'll not spend a lot of time breaking all that down, but you do have to understand that there's at least one father and son set of casualties on that wall in Washington, D.C. So this is a multi-generational conflict that went on and on and on and on. The key to the start of it was Vietnam trying to become an independent country after World War II. They had been taken over by Japan. They had been a French colony. They then claimed independence after Japan was defeated, and France wanted to reconquer its old colony. And that set the stage for the whole thing. Because of the containment policy, because the leader of the North Vietnamese, the Vietnamese, was Ho Chi Minh, who was a freedom fighter, yes, but also a communist. Because of containment, we backed the French. And so we got into this colonial war where we supported the French. We supported them for 9 years, and after 9 years of they're about to win back their colony, they are soundly defeated by the Vietnamese, the so-called Viet Minh was the name of the army. In 1954, that the French just gave up the ghost and went back home to France, and there it was. At that point in time, there was a conference held in Geneva, Switzerland, to try to settle this conflict that had been going on since World War II. And they temporarily divided Vietnam into two sections, a north and a south, as you can see on the map there. And in the north, which was where the headquarters of the Viet Minh, this communist slash independent fighter group of people headed up by Ho Chi Minh, was headquartered. And another group of wannabe leaders in the south at the old French capital city, when it was a colony of Saigon, down in the south, as you can see at the two extreme ends of this long, curved, S-shaped, kind of snake-shaped like country. And instead of having some sort of meeting of the minds or a compromise or a political argument, they had a civil war. And the dividing point was this arbitrary 17th parallel. And the southern government in the south and the communist government in the north continued to fight. It was about this time that the United States basically had a choice whether to get in or get out of the Civil War, and President Eisenhower promulgated what was known as the domino theory. And you can see that the stack of dominoes is being pushed over by a Vietnamese, and it's going to knock over Vietnam, but also the surrounding countries of Southeast Asia. And the only thing preventing all those countries to fall, like a stack of dominoes, to communism are the Americans. And that was just an extension of containment policy, and that's why Eisenhower preached that we had to be involved in Vietnam, and so we were. Now, there are a couple complicating factors to this in that we think of North and South, like the American Civil War, slavery in the South, anti-slavery in the North, and things like that. But the North-South thing here in Vietnam is just an arbitrary line drawn on the map. There's not only communists in the north and only non-communists in the south. There's communists all over the country, and there's non-communists all over the country. It was a political thing. But the division was geographic. And there were citizen soldiers who were partisans, were what we would today call insurgents, who were communists, known as the Vietnamese Communists, or shortened to Viet Cong. And the Viet Cong were all over the country. And because of the shape of Vietnam, from the headquarters of the communist government in the north, they could supply the South with both their own soldiers, NVA, North Vietnamese Army, soldiers, or supplies to the Viet Cong by going down parallel paths through Cambodia and Laos, as you can see there, not in Vietnam at all. So they could supply people without ever being even in the country. It was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that's just a cartoonist rendering that from Eisenhower on the left to Gerald Ford on the right, it went through 5 U.S. presidencies that we were about to win this conflict. Victory just around the corner. And in the phase from this 1954 division of the country through 1964, about 10 years, we spent our time spending money and sending personnel to help, to advise the South Vietnamese, ARVN, the Army of South Vietnam, to fight against the Army of North Vietnam. NVA and ARVN were the 2 combatants, and we were advisors to the South, to ARVN. But in 1963, of course, as we know, John Kennedy was assassinated, and it became Vice President, now President Lyndon Johnson's war. And he said he didn't want to expand the war, but we certainly weren't going to lose Vietnam to communism, the old domino theory. And in 1964, something happened that caused the war to expand. This was something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. In the Gulf of Tonkin incident, one of our naval ships was attacked, or maybe was attacked, in the Gulf of Tonkin, which you can see is right there in the curve of the North Vietnamese coast, right near Hanoi, the capital city. And it's never been proven whether there was an attack or not. There was some talk that it might have been dolphins as opposed to torpedoes that went by the boat, the naval boat. It was never been confirmed, but in later years it's kind of been highly suspected that maybe this was a little bit invented. It's still not known. However, it was sufficient for President Johnson to go to Congress and get a resolution based on the testimony right there of the Secretary of Defense that we had to defend our troops and our interests in this area because no one could tell the United States what to do. And in fact, readily, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that was not a declaration of war, but gave the president the authority to wage war without actually having a formal declaration. And President Johnson took that resolution and went with it. And that led to the introduction of so-called ground troops. Ground troops in the sense that these were American troops fighting as the Americans, the U.S., the Marines, branch of the Navy, or the Army, as later came as well, fighting as American forces, fighting for American interests in a foreign country, as opposed to advising just ARVN. And so a major escalation, a growth of our expansion of our effort in Vietnam happened because of this. In November of that same year, 1965, there was a major battle in, as you can see on the map, the sort of central portion of South Vietnam in the Nha Drang Valley. And it was a force of Americans against a force of a fairly substantial force of North Vietnamese army personnel. Not so much insurgents as the actual army that had come south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and popped across into Vietnam. And there was this major battle. It was a battle that was later the subject of a book written by the general, Hal Moore, the American general, who led the American troops in the battle. It later was a major documentary on TV that, again, with General Moore. And then the movie that came out that's starred Mel Gibson, all had similar names, was based on both the movie and, to an extent, the documentary. And that's the movie that you'll be watching. So, just in general, in the context of all that, this introduction of ground troops was led by General William Westmoreland, who believed that the United States in concentration could outfight not only the North Vietnamese, but were much better fighters than the South Vietnamese, and therefore it was time for the United States essentially to take over the war, and that's exactly what happened. And this led to more and more and more troops being sent to Vietnam. And you can see right there that by 1968, there were more than 500,000 American troops in Vietnam fighting. And most of them are fighting. There's support troops, yes, but much of this is Americans out in the field, in the bush. So just to repeat, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a major thorn in the side of the South Vietnamese and the United States because, as the map shows you, there are many, many branches from the trail, these series of paths down through Laos and Cambodia, where you could sneak across the border and voila, you're there in the middle of Vietnam without ever having set foot in Vietnam until 5 seconds ago. Both the Viet Cong insurgents and the North Vietnamese army soldiers could easily slip over the border, move north and south along this trail to redeploy any place. So they could come and go at will without really being traceable. In 1968, the NVA used the Ho Chi Minh Trail to coordinate an attack, a concentrated attack on South Vietnam that became a turning point, a critical turning point in the war. It was called the Tet Offensive, Tet, the Vietnamese New Year. It's a time when they had, in the past, taken a couple days off from war to have a blowout. Everybody was celebrating. The war was on hold, and that's just the way it was. And much like the Hessians at Trenton, New Jersey, in Christmas of 1776, are surprised by Washington's army because they're celebrating Christmas, while the South is celebrating Tet. The North is not. What they're doing is surprising an attack at over 24 points in South Vietnam that all happened simultaneously, and they were able to deploy their North Vietnamese troops by virtue of this Ho Chi Minh Trail. During the Tet Offensive, the North Vietnamese even entered the U.S. compound in downtown Saigon. It was a terrible shock to the system. And after a month, a little bit more than a month of fighting, the United States troops, with the help of ARVN, the South Vietnamese army, defeated this offensive everywhere, including, in the picture here, the ancient city of Hue. I mentioned the ancient city of Hue and the Tet Offensive together because if you've watched Full Metal Jacket, probably the most famous movie about the Vietnam War, the final house-to-house battle scene in that movie is this right here, the fall of the ancient city of Hue, fighting between North Vietnamese army and the United States. As General Westmoreland said, as we defeated this offensive, their well-laid plans ran afoul, which was true, but the problem wasn't that we didn't win the battle in a technical sense. We've talked before about tactical and strategic kinds of considerations. It had been thought in the United States and around the world, basically, that the North Vietnamese were too weak to attack, and they were so weak that the United States would soon win a victory out and out. And Tet proved that that wasn't the case. The United States was not about to win the war, and the North Vietnamese were fully capable of fighting a war, and we had a full-scale war on our hands. It was not that we were losing, but that we were not winning, and that was a shock to the system of many, many Americans. And one of the consequences of that was the great increase in the anti-war protest. You said we were winning, and here we are being attacked by these people that we thought couldn't attack us. And the history of the anti-war protests took a spike after the Tet Offensive of January of 1968. And so it's President Johnson's war for good or bad. And one of the consequences of this Tet Offensive is Johnson didn't seek re-election. He was, as you can see here, pretty shaken by the fact that we thought we were winning, and he thought we were winning, and here, maybe not as much as we thought. Richard Nixon was elected president, became Richard Nixon's war, and he had a plan to end the war. First was something called Vietnamization, which would mean turning the war back over to the South Vietnamese. But to help do that, he was actually going to expand the war. He did expand the war by going, what made sense militarily, to attack those trails and those bases outside Vietnam along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia and Laos in a military sense. But it didn't take into account that expanding a war that was being increasingly seen as a failure would upset the people at home. And this caused even more protest as it came into fruition in the spring, April, and May of 1970, 50 years ago. And 50 years ago yesterday, this all erupted down the road from us at Kent State, where the Ohio National Guard, in trying to keep order on campus, ended up opening fire and killing 4 students and severely wounding several others. The worst example, or the most serious example, I guess you would say, of a clash of protesters and authorities in this whole era. However, that kind of explosion of protests in 1970 and afterwards led to concerted peace negotiations by President Nixon and his Secretary of State to get us out of Vietnam. Nixon kept talking about peace with honor, not victory, but with honor. In 1971, 2/3 of all Americans polled said they were against the war. And so the negotiations went back and forth, seemingly endlessly. But by the spring of 1973, the United States withdrew all troops from Vietnam for the first time since the 1950s. The POWs came home. You may know, although he's deceased now, of Senator John McCain. John McCain ran for president back in the early 2000s. He was in the same political party, but a sharp critic of President Trump until he passed away, not this last year, but the year before. But he had been held in the so-called Hanoi Hilton, shot down as a pilot over North Vietnam, and it came to be kind of the poster person of that POW experience. Our long, direct involvement was over. 2 years later, without us there doing the fighting, the South that we had fought with for all that time fell to the North, who we'd fought against all that time, and after all, the country was reunited as a communist country. Our last day in Vietnam, in any capacity of that sort, was in April of 1975, when we evacuated as many all Americans and as many of the South Vietnamese as we possibly could as the South fell to the North. The fall of South Vietnam made it seem like we had lost the war, and we didn't lose the war. The United States did not militarily, was not defeated. But when popular opinion turned against the war and the government made a decision basically to pull out, and we did pull out, and our allies then lost, made it seem like we were, at the worst, backing a loser all those years. Further complicating all that, are we really fighting for something, is that the domino effect never happened. North Vietnam, a communist entity, controlled all of Vietnam and made it a communist country, and nothing further happened. No further dominoes fell. It's kind of an ironic picture. A flag, a red flag with a sickle and hammer is a communist symbol, and in fact, it's the flag of the USSR, that same motif. And of course, KFC with Colonel Sanders is a fried chicken motif. And there they are, US capitalism and Soviet style communism, cheek by jowl with each other right there together in downtown Hanoi after the unification as a communist country. To this very day, Vietnam's a communist country, except they are communists who happen to be capitalists. In fact, one of our leading trading partners. So that was the Vietnam War in 20 minutes. Our side, the South, lost. It seemed like we lost. The Vietnam Wall went up, and it's a very impressive thing. You need to go and see it, especially if you have family that names are on that wall. It is a very moving thing to find your friends on that wall. And that's the aftermath of the story. All right, we'll talk in a second about your movie assignment.